this wonderful adventure and our second session today. The title for this one, so this morning we were focusing principally on efforts to reduce suffering. Noon, we're talking about programs aiming to promote flourishing, promote good health. So I think you know by now that this is Dr. James Doty. He's spoken a few times when we've needed his input. He's a neurosurgeon, an extremely prestigious, very high profession in the West, someone we all look up to. He is also the founder and the director of an organization called the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research at Stanford University, where he is also on the surgery faculty. In addition to that, he's an inventor. He invents new ideas and new ways to solve problems. And an entrepreneur, he then figures out how to get those ideas out quickly into the world where they can be adopted and used to improve people's lives. He's invented a very important piece of equipment that makes it much, much more efficient to treat people with illness in their brain. So he has a very fascinating personal story. He's deeply involved in service to the world. He'll talk about scientific research on compassion and altruism. He'll talk about applications of that scientific knowledge in the clinic, in educational programs, in the education of professionals and others. And he's also thinking now, and I don't know how much he'll go into that, on a much larger scale, about very large-scale interventions at the level of a whole society, getting people together to find their compassion. So it's quite an exciting story, and I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. James Doty.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's really a blessing to be here with you and an honor to be with so many distinguished colleagues. I thank the Abbotts for the invitation, and it's really wonderful to spend some time with the monks. All of us are here to learn, and it's been extraordinary how much back and forth dialogue there has been. Before I really, though, begin my talk, I would really like to thank His Holiness for being the founding benefactor of our center at Stanford University. I had initially begun my own formal scientific explorations into compassion, very informally, interacting with some of my colleagues, some against their will. But one of the things that I had been really impressed with was the message of His Holiness regarding compassion and its importance. Geshe Jinpala, who all of you know, was a facilitator of a meeting that I had with His Holiness. And after a short conversation with His Holiness, he became quite excited about the research that we had begun at Stanford. And we talked for some time, far beyond the time allocated. And really my goal was to get His Holiness to come to Stanford simply to give a talk on compassion in the hopes that this would stimulate interest in the university. And indeed, he immediately did so. And in fact, it was interesting because he actually called out a monk to figure out what day. Now, I assume when he called out the monk, someone would come out with a laptop computer and flip it open and type in, and we would know what days were available. But in fact, a wonderful monk came out with a very large ledger and opened it up, and we picked out a date that way. But the most extraordinary thing about that meeting was that at the end, he began this animated conversation with Jinpala in Tibetan. And Jinpa at the end of it said to me, "Your Holiness is so impressed with this endeavor you're undertaking that he wishes to make a donation." And this donation he made turned out to be one of the largest donations he'd made to a non-Tibetan cause. And it was really overwhelming. And to take money from the Dalai Lama, I'm not sure if that's a good thing, but I took it nonetheless. So that actually was the start of this center, which has now become a center within the Stanford Neuroscience Institute. And amazingly, not only did Jinpa La continue in that relationship, but for the last 3 years, he has spent a week a month coming to Stanford to help not only with the center, but to work with us to develop what we call our Compassion Cultivation Training Program, which is really a centerpiece of the work that we are doing. Learning ways, figuring out ways to cultivate compassion in individuals, to let them, help them overcome their suffering. What I'd like to do today is to give a brief overview of some of the key points in the discussions to date regarding changing the brain with contemplative practice, focusing on compassion and the ever-increasing body of evidence that demonstrates its value. I will also comment on such training in regard to broad applications, not only to individuals themselves, but particular situations, and also to society as a whole. My own interest in this area actually was stimulated as a result of personal experience. While I will not go into all the details, I will share with you that I grew up in poverty in difficult and trying circumstances. Neither of my parents had gone to college. And in this particular situation, oftentimes I would feel hopelessness and despair. And when an individual, as I think many of you can imagine, are in this situation, this can lead to negative behaviors, or if you will, afflictive emotions. And as a result, this can lead to negative behaviors. And in fact, I engaged in these behaviors, and not only was I at risk for injury to myself, but also potentially even going to jail. But something incredible happened. And this thing that happened actually was my first experience with neuroplasticity. And I'll tell you this story. When I was 13 years old, I went into a magic shop, and the owner of the magic shop was not there, but his mother was there. And she knew nothing about magic, but she knew something else. And after a conversation with her for about 20 minutes, she said to me, and she looked me in the eyes, with these eyes that were very warm, and she said, if you come here every day for the next 6 weeks, I'll teach you something that I think could change your life. And what she taught me, believe it or not, was a mindfulness practice, which was combined with a visualization technique and in some respects the power of positive thinking. And that interaction led to a transformation of my mind from viewing the world with potentially little possibilities or no possibilities to one of infinite possibility. From this experience, I learned attention and focus, and I also learned that it is only within the individual that we can decide what our future will be. Over the past few days, you have heard from my colleagues discussing evolution, neuroanatomy, empathy, compassion, affiliative behavior, and the impact of genetics and the environment. And another thing that has been briefly talked about is this concept of in-group versus out-group. And this will come to or I will talk about it a little bit later, but I just want you to remember that for the moment, because it's very important in how individuals interact within the groups and potentially how they yet interact within the larger society. Research is wonderful. It's a great intellectual exercise. We can learn a great deal. But the reality is, unless we can take the information that we learn and use it to improve the human condition, it really, to me at least, is not that beneficial. But what are those conditions that I'm talking about? Let me give you some examples. In industrialized countries, or the first world, and in particularly the United States, we have an epidemic of isolation, depression, and loneliness. Can you imagine 1 in 4 people feel that they have no one to talk to when they are in pain or when they are suffering? For many, the gift of being a human being who has a memory of the past and a conception of a future, this has not resulted in happiness, but it has resulted in regret, anxiety, fear, and unhappiness. The other interesting point is that our species was never meant to live in this modern world. We are inundated with information and responsibilities, frankly, far beyond those which we were really able as a species to accept. And this has become part of the problem. Remember, cities only began where there were congregations of people 5,000 years ago. Until 10,000 years ago, we lived as hunter-gatherer tribes in groups of only 10 to 50 people. Hunter-gathering was the primary survival strategy of our species, and it had been the case for almost 2 million years. Yet what is extraordinary, our DNA, that which defines us as human, has not significantly changed in 200,000 years. So if we were able to find a frozen person from 200,000 years ago and brought him into our society, he theoretically could function just like us. But imagine what he would see. Ultimately, though, the fact that our DNA has not changed has implications again to this concept of an end group. Let me start first with evolution. Certainly we know that in insect species there's clear evidence of cooperation. In regard to mammals and especially the human species, multiple colleagues of mine have spoken about this strong maternal-child bond. We even also see significant evidence for parental bonding. But why have this? Why is this even necessary? Well, let me explain why, and I think you'll see clearly. For humans to evolve with the capacity for abstract thinking, having the ability to have a large working memory, to have complex communication and language, and to have theory of mind, the ability to relate one's emotions to oneself and of others has come at a huge cost to our species. And that cost has been a very long gestational period, a small litter size, and the fact that our offspring require interaction with the mother for years and years just to survive. Yet there is little reward to the mother for this. But because of this fact, to ensure the survival of our species, there have developed very complex mechanisms to bond the mother with the child to ensure that the child survives. One of those mechanisms has been mentioned already, and that is oxytocin, which is one of many. And oxytocin has become known as the nurturing or bonding hormone. As we extended our species beyond this small family to the hunter-gatherers, this same bonding which had developed was very important for these small tribes to have individuals cooperate and to survive as a species in a very hostile environment, and also to survive against other similar groups who potentially wanted what this other group had. Interestingly, in addition to that pathway, the end product of that pathway, though, is that when this bonding or cooperation occurred, these areas in the brain associated with reward or pleasure actually were also activated, which was, again, another powerful stimulus to cooperate, not only within the family and the mother to care for a child, but within these small groups. Many have quoted Darwin, implying that it is the strongest or the most ruthless that survive. But as you can see by this quote, and what has now been demonstrated in a variety of studies, while in the short term being ruthless can result in advantage, in the long term it is a disadvantage. It is only those species that are cooperative and, if you will, are kind, which survive in the long term. We have evolved to care. And it has been mentioned before, this is our default mode, to care for others. As we have talked about neuroanatomy and brain function, one of those discussions has been about the amygdala as being that primitive part of the brain that is associated with what is commonly called the fear response or the flight or fight response. It is that part of the brain that will take over in a situation where an individual is threatened. And you can imagine the advantage of that. If you think back to that time in Africa when our species was in its infancy and one was confronted with a lion or other type of threat, there were these mechanisms that allowed for the species to survive. And what that mechanism would do, it would activate our sympathetic nervous system, which would result in the release of a variety of hormones to allow us to run fast, if you will, and either escape the threat or not. And if we escaped, we would immediately go down to this balance or homeostatic level where our sympathetic nervous system, again, that associated with the flight or fight, would equilibrate with the parasympathetic nervous system, which is associated with calmness, relaxation of our sphincters, and a sense of cooperation. As I mentioned, our society, though, has evolved far beyond our evolution, and there is often an imbalance whereby we are constantly, for many people, in a vigilant or hyper-vigilant situation where we have this constant level of anxiety, which translates into fear and suffering. And it is the translation of the effects of that hypervigilance which results in many deleterious health effects that span a broad range from depression to sleep disorders to cardiac conditions to different types of pain conditions. But there is hope, and that's what we're going to focus on. We have really been fortunate now that for over 3 decades, scientists have been engaged in trying to unravel the effects of mind training on the brain and how to unlock the potential of that training so that it can help others. And as I've told you from my own example, that effect was quite powerful. We are fortunate also for the fact that there is Buddhism and Buddhist meditators because they have been perfect partners in this endeavor. For over several millennia, we know that great time and energy has been spent by Buddhist practitioners in developing a taxonomy of mental life and also understanding the processes in which one can train their brain. In fact, obviously, they appreciated this concept of neuroplasticity or changing one's brain when Western science was simply a glimmer. And in fact, of course, many of you know that for many years in Western science, there was in fact a belief that the brain could not change at all. I would like to give you an example now. I keep going the wrong way. Of the program that we have developed at Stanford University with the invaluable contribution of Geshe-la. We have talked about these terms empathy, compassion, and altruism. Why are we focused on these? We know that mindfulness practice can give us great ability to be attentive, but we've also seen that compassion can give us greater resilience in regard to our amygdala function and reactivation, and examples of this have been quoted previously. We also know that these types of practices can bring into alignment or balance our autonomic and our parasympathetic nervous systems. I had mentioned that cooperation or kindness results in activation of our reward centers, and here's an example of that, demonstrating the caudate and the nucleus accumbens responding to reward in their pleasure centers, if you will, from cooperative behavior. The course that we have developed at Stanford is an 8-week course that has a contribution, of course, from Buddhist practice, including metta and Tonglen. It involves 2 hours of instruction per week and 20 to 30 minutes of meditation practice per day. This is an example not of a study that we've done, but it reminds me that these types of practices, even, well, I mentioned this 8-week practice, even as short as 2 weeks of practice results in effects on cardiac function, has been mentioned, results in effects on the immune system, as well as a decrease in those hormones that are associated with the stress response. This 8-week course begins, if you will, and somehow we lost a slide here, but that's okay, with initially teaching attention and settling the mind. The next part of this is having an individual connect with that sense of love for another so that they feel this sense of caring and concern at a very deep level. And of course, for most of us, it is associated with those who we care for the most, which typically is our children. Then the other aspect, and this is a problem which is significant in the West, is this concept of self-compassion, whereby many people are very hypercritical in the West. As a result, they cannot give compassion easily to others because they don't care for themselves, they don't love themselves. So a great deal of time is spent in the concept of training them in self-compassion. The next aspect of this is the extension of that compassion we talked about, that, if you will, the bond to your child or one who love a great deal, to extend to someone you may be indifferent about. And the goal of each week of practice beyond this is to have this ever-expanding sense of caring and loving, if you will, moistening your heart towards the other, and also taking on the suffering of another. We have now done studies on this technique which show that it is indeed possible, and it has been shown in other studies, that you can indeed not only increase one's sense of compassion for others, but the data has shown from the studies we have done that you can increase compassion for yourself. But another key part, oftentimes for people, is that they have a hard time receiving compassion or care from another. And this has been shown that this practice also significantly improves one's ability to accept compassion. What is the potential, though, with these types of training? Now, we know that, at least in the studies done to date, and most of these practices are 8 to 9 weeks, although studies have been done with interventions, if you will, as short as 1 to 2 weeks, that show an effect. Tanya will be starting a year study here soon, a longitudinal study to see the long-term effects. We clearly know that these interventions to date have an impact, as I said, in regard to cardiac function, vascular function, mental states such as depression and anxiety. But what we don't know for sure is, are they long-lasting? Do you have to do, once you receive an initial intervention, do you have to continue with that for a period of time or forever to maintain its effect on your health? We don't have an answer to that at this point. But there are many engaged people who are looking at these areas to find the answers. We certainly know, simply by looking at the effect these practices have had on Buddhist meditators, that they can be profound. And I think all of us are hopeful that these practices will continue to demonstrate these effects. Remember, for these to be incorporated within a larger society, though, they of course have to be secularized. And then hopefully what we will learn is how to refine these techniques so that they are the most robust, if you will, and have the greatest effect and the longest lasting effect. But let me talk a little bit about some of the opportunities here and some of the areas that myself and my colleagues are looking at. One thing, certainly in regard to mindfulness, has been interest in use in the educational system. We are looking at combining that, which is a component of our Stanford practice, with this compassion practice to also use in the schools. The point of which is to give students the tools that will allow them to focus better, hopefully perform academically better. But another real problem in schools, at least in the United States, is associated with bullying, where children beat up other children. Hopefully, these types of practices will have an effect. There are a number of programs in schools that have demonstrated this. It's just that we don't know which is the best at this point and how to continue it on, if you will, and how sticky it is, if you will. Certainly, we've already talked about the effect on individuals in society. But let's talk a minute about business. For most of us, a great deal of our waking hours are spent at work. Yet in the US, $200 to $300 billion a year is lost, secondary to the effects, if you will, of suffering, which has translated into stress at the workplace. And why do you have stress at the workplace? What does that mean? Typically, it translates into individuals being at work and having fear. And remember, we talked about this fear response and being hypervigilant. Well, you're chronically in this state. It is very difficult to be productive. And in fact, fear, a lack of trust, a sense of lack of communication, or finding your job meaningless have a huge impact on your satisfaction and happiness. It's even estimated that between $500 to $7,500 a year in the United States is the cost per employee for this type of stress. And this can translate into what we call absenteeism or presenteeism, where they're at work but they're not really working. And it has a huge effect on healthcare costs. Every individual who has health conditions associated with stress, it costs 50% more to care for them compared, if you will, to a healthy employee. Let's talk about the prison system. There are already demonstrated programs, primarily associated with mindfulness, in the prison systems. And remember, in the United States especially, we have the largest number of incarcerated individuals in the world. Yet, do many of you really believe that most of those people are there because they are bad people? I would submit to you that, in fact, most of them are just like you or I. yet they have not been shown nurturing and caring in their lives. Imagine, though, if we can bring these practices to the prison systems. What are the biggest problems in the prison system? One is recidivism. Prisoners come back repeatedly once they're released. The other is violence. Violence in prisons is a huge problem. We already see, though, with just the implementation of mindfulness practice in select areas, we can decrease the rate of violence by 50 to 75%. Let me give you another interesting example of a program that also looks to open the heart of individuals. In a select group of prisoners who had been written off for not caring, for being violent, for being mean, they were given the opportunity to do two things. One was to train a service animal. And in the training of this service animal, in the U.S. what we have are animals that have been trained specifically to care for impaired or disabled individuals or blind individuals. So animals are trained either as guide dogs or service dogs to pick up things or to direct an individual to a certain place. So these are called service animals. So in this particular case, prisoners were, number one, given the opportunity to raise, care for, and help train an animal. The effect of that action itself, whereby these individuals were given the opportunity to care for another, allow them to open their hearts and become completely engaged. But what's more extraordinary about this, though, is that while this opened their hearts and they grew attached to the animal, what was the thing that they ultimately had to do?
Give it up.
They had to give it up. Yet what did they learn? They learned love, they learned connection, and then they learned how to give it away. And that interaction had a huge impact. It gave them their dignity back. It gave them a sense that they could be loved by this animal, and it gave them a sense that they could give love by giving this animal away. An extraordinary example of the potential of these types of interventions. One of the things that we're engaged in now at Stanford is actually working with veterans who have come back from these conflicts and have post-traumatic stress disorder. Sona had talked about degrees of scientific rigor, and what I will tell you is not scientific rigor, it is more of testimonial. But we are beginning to actually design experiments to test the effect. But we have now taken multiple groups of veterans who have been clearly diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and have had them go through our training. And again, at least anecdotally, these interventions have been remarkable. And if you know anything about post-traumatic stress disorder, this is a condition that is extraordinarily difficult to treat. Medications have not been particularly useful. Different types of psychological interventions have been tried and have had limited utility. But at least it appears in this early work that we've done, and I think others are doing now, it seems to have a significant effect where people are able to monitor and regulate their emotions better. They have a sense of an understanding within their mind of connection to others and its importance and its value to them, and are able now to, instead of blocking off a connection with another or being fearful, to have a more open-hearted approach. In closing, I would like to talk about something on a little bit of a larger scale, which gets to this in-group and out-group problem. As you heard from my earlier conversation when we talked about in-group, and there was a study that was done, it is limited. We can give this intranasal oxytocin, and within your small defined in-group, it's wonderful to make you feel like you want to hug somebody, that you love them. We talked about an economic game. We gave all your money to that person. The problem is, and this is where this evolution comes in, where we talk about our DNA not being changed from 200,000 years ago when we were hunter-gatherers, it's limited to this small group. The challenge for all of us, and hopefully that we are going to find as we learn more about brain function and these different types of intervention, can we extend and enlarge our in-group to encompass all sentient beings? When there was a slide that was shown, I think by Richie, that talked about the heart of compassion. The problems that our society faces are not existential problems. These are problems of the heart, whether it's global warming, whether it's ecological destruction, whether it's war, whether it is poverty. These are manifestations of problems of the human heart. And until we focus our technology and our science on these areas within ourselves, these problems are not going to be solved. His Holiness has said, compassion and kindness are not luxuries. They are necessities if our species is to survive. And I would end on that note, and I believe every neuroscientist here, and I think probably everyone in this room, appreciates this reality. And I am hopeful that with the caliber of scientists and with the heart of the individuals in this room, that we can address these problems and hopefully expand our in-group so that your in-group isn't the person next door. Your in-group is that person across the ocean. Your world isn't limited to what you can see outside of your yard. It is the whole world. And when we are able to do that, then our species will flourish. Thank you.